Well, good afternoon, everybody. Well, afternoon here in London. Lovely to see you, and wonderful to see so many old and new friends join us today. And so, good afternoon and to you as well. It's a very, very great pleasure to welcome Professor Halle to speak to us today on the history of German anthropology. This fits, of course, with the sort of thing that the Institute has been interested in for many years now in all sorts of ways. As some of you will know, we've had country days. We've looked at anthropology in Austria, anthropology in France, anthropology in Norway, as well also as thinking generally about the place of the history of anthropology in the Royal Anthropological Institute. And of course, in all our minds is when we think about the overall European context of anthropology, is the place of Germany. How are we to understand the extraordinary contribution which was made to ethnography in Germany throughout the earlier period of anthropology, as Hans Vermeulen has made so absolutely clear in that wonderful book, Before Boas? How are we to understand the cataclysm of particularly of the Second World War and its influence on Germany? And again, how are we to understand the extraordinary, really wonderful environment from many points of view for academic work and anthropology in Germany after the Second World War? And if I could just give a tiny example, the Ruhr Universität Bochum, from which, of course, Professor Halle comes, where he holds his academic chair. I've got a very, very fond memory of Bochum, because I gave a paper to a conference there already now more than 20 years ago, perhaps some 25 years ago. And after I'd given my paper, a whole group of German colleagues came up to me and said, we're working in a similar area to yours. Would you please join us and be part of be a collaborator in our research teams? And ever since then, I've had very, very close contacts with these particular group of German colleagues, and I've never ceased to be grateful to them, because they are indeed wonderful colleagues. And so we should, I think, turn to Professor Halle and ask him to talk about his own particular interest. And we have his book here, as you'll see, on the history of anthropology, ethnography in Germany in the Bundesrepublik between 1945 and 1990. Of course, he may not be speaking directly to this topic, but it infuses his presentation, I'm sure. So please, Dieter, the floor is yours, and we look forward very much to your presentation. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Hanin, and thank you, David, for that great introduction. And thank you all for being here and showing interest in that topic, which is kind of neglected in international anthropological discussions. The history of German anthropology has always interested me, because when I was a student in the early 80s, gosh, that's ages ago, the German anthropology was absent. What we did learn, and I don't speak just for myself, but also for colleagues of the same age group, they were involved in French approaches, in Lévi-Strauss, in Dumont, and others, Léry. We were taught, of course, of American cultural anthropology, and these were our ancestors and our heritage. And of course, also the British tradition. To some lesser extent, the Italian, also some Swedish, and so on. But strangely enough, what happened within Germany after 45, after the Second World War, was, so to say, a non-topic. It was absent. So my teachers, for example, they all considered themselves as basically internationalized. And when I looked at their studies that they did, I mean, 20 years before I started, or 25, 30 years before, They also of course, they took political science courses and so on. And it was basically American, British, Western democratic influences. So for a time that was not very important to me, because as a student, of course, you look for other things, you look for field research and so on. But the older I got, the more I wanted to know about, why is what happened in the last 60, 70 years within what German anthropologists do, not a topic within German anthropology itself. And I'm going to share my presentation here, a PowerPoint presentation. Sometimes they are quite boring. Now I'm looking for other ways to organize my presentations, but okay, we are still here with a PowerPoint presentation. And I will start like someone who takes over a new government. What does he do? What does she do when a new government is elected? Of course, they do all the cruelties. They kill all their followers, the ones that supported him, and could be dangerous. And of course, they do. But what I'm going to say, they do the cruelties at the beginning, and so that's what I'm doing with you now here at the beginning of this talk, because it has to be talked about, the labels with which in Germany what we call ethnologie is meant. And therefore it's necessary to look at the terms that were used. The first one, anthropologie, in Germany does not refer to social or cultural anthropology, but basically to physical and philosophical disciplines. So it cannot be translated into what Anglo speakers or French speakers or Spanish speakers consider as anthropology. And therefore, the term Sozialanthropologie is not a translation of social anthropology. Because in Germany, we had a discipline that tied biology and culture together, which was basically, a follower of Nazi race studies. And this discipline existed until the 60s. So if we nowadays German colleagues call themselves Sozialanthropologen, I would say you don't know what you're talking about. If they call themselves social anthropologists, I can live with that. So there is this, it's quite complicated. Kulturanthropologie is also not the translation for what is meant by cultural anthropology. Because in Germany, this is mainly media analysis or analysis of literature, and it is not fieldwork in our sense. It is not going out and living with people, using our methods, having our interests in our epistemological interests. Now, maybe you stumbled over the term Völkerkunde once. Völkerkunde, I mean, is there a more German word than that? Völker means people, and Kunde is, well, the teaching of or knowledge about. And Völkerkunde was a term that came very early, came up in the I would say in the 1880s as a scientific discipline. Of course, the term is much older, and it is related to these old ideas of the white explorer going out to the natives, researching them in their place, and writing ethnographies. Now, the professional organization of the ethnographen, Ethnologen in Germany, until 3 years ago, still had that name. It was the Deutsche Gesellschaft, German Society for Völkerkunde. Why? Not because anybody practiced this kind of Völkerkunde anymore, but because in the sessions of all these meetings in the last 40 or 50 years, there were never enough members present who could change the name. And Völkerkunde remained in place, even though everybody called themselves Ethnologen. Ethnologie is also, that's what I use, is also not the same like in the British context or the American, like ethnology, like folklore studies and so on. Rather, with the term ethnology, what we call social and cultural anthropology can be expressed. So it's a cover term that joins both, and that's why I use them. Difficult, huh? It's hard to understand, and I mean, I can understand if you're already asleep, but it's necessary not to confuse the German terms, which seem to be the same as the Anglo terms, like Sozial anthropology, which is not social anthropology. Therefore, we have that term ethnology. So if you think that is hard stuff, it's getting worse. But I admit this is the last hard bit of the thing. As I already said, the professional organization was named from Deutsche Gesellschaft für Völkerkunde into Deutsche Gesellschaft für Sozial and Kulturanthropologie. That means the term ethnology, was jumped over for, and the discipline still calls itself ethnology. So it's a kind of strange mess. Why did the professional organization name it themselves social and cultural anthropology? Well, in that session, the quorum to change the statutes of the organization was there. And so for the first time, they could really change a name. And nowadays, younger students who are, well, how should I put it, more morally inflicted with question of racism, colonialism, and so on, they were looking for a term that is not poisoned by this term ethno. Ethno is bad because ethno is folk, a group. It's something evil, and therefore they choose Sozial and Kulturanthropologie. But to them, it was identical with what they presumed to be innocent disciplines. So they had no idea that cultural and social anthropology, for example, and their history, their implication into colonialism, that was not discussed. That was not a topic that was accepted. And stupidly, as people present are, they did not call themselves social and cultural anthropologists in English, but in German, with these already poisoned Nazi, and in the case of Kulturanthropologie, literary studies. So it's a big mess. And why do I talk about that? I talk about that because it shows in a way that the self-understanding of the discipline and of the ones who study the work in ethnological or ethnologischen institutes, museums, is in Germany very much dependent on turmoil and breaks in historical periods. So it reacts, this kind of naming mess, reacts always to current political ideas of self-representation. And through telling you all these differences, maybe we get an entrance into what I'm going to show you in the presentation, basically, which is focusing on different generations of colleagues, their theoretical, their social political, and their social networking connections. As David already has shown, my book, The History of Federal German Anthropology from 45 to 90, which is, it's a bit unfair because the Federal Republic of Germany came into being only in 49. But I wanted to say, okay, from the end of World War II until the unification. I left out the East German traditions in my research, and I also left out the years after unification. Of course, I am working on that as well, but I had to put a limit. And because the project it was funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung with very well, and but it was limited. So I thought, okay, what I'm going to do, I'm limiting myself to the framework, the political framework of Western Germany after World War II until unification. Colleagues try to expand now the history of the Eastern traditions and of the newer ones, but I didn't do that. The other outcome of that research project was a website where you can access, it's like Alan McFarlane's idea of interviews with colleagues on what did motivate them into becoming anthropologists, and why did they choose that, what are the challenges that they found in their profession, and so on. And so I carried out 51 interviews, which can be accessed either or as video interviews or as transcripted videos, because several colleagues didn't want to be seen on video. So we had these two possibilities, plus 236 short biographies. So if you want to go to that page, www.germananthropology.com, you will find this material, which maybe tells you a bit more about the wider impact that the ethnology had in Germany. And on that webpage, it's not just post-45, it's also pre-45, which means starting in the late 19th century. So it's there you can find time-wise, chronologically, a deeper knowledge or more information about the trends. Yeah. Is there still something like a German anthropology? Are there remnants of a Sonderweg? I mean, all these traditions that David mentioned in passing, the cultural morphology of Frobenius, the cultural historical approach of the of Wilhelm Schmidt, for example, ethnosociology from Turnwald. These were all fields of ethnology in Germany pre-45. Some of them had their outcome still a bit later, but they're all basically disappeared or changed into different directions. So, sorry, I would say there is nothing more. There's not anymore something like a German Sonderweg post-45. And I will give a few impulses. Colleagues and myself are trained in and receive or have a very vivid reception of trends and approaches and fields of knowledge that come from the US, the UK, and the French theories of France. Also, there are strong personal interconnection with Switzerland and Austria. Then the rebranding of the organization was already mentioned. two German socialized anthropologists led the EASA subsequently, and also the writing conventions of how to write articles have changed in the last, I would say, 40 years very much. I could say they have Americanized. Before you had in anthropological journals, in German journals, you had more detailed material presentation, be it from fieldwork or be it about artifacts, whatever. So it was more, let's say, presenting the deep field of knowledge on the basis of field experiences or object analysis. This has changed. Yeah, sometimes you find now in the journals hardly anything about what colleagues really did outside, but more discussions about grand themes like linking everything to either to globalization. Today it's colonialism in Germany, or racism, or whatever, and then of course entering the theory debates. But sometimes, or very often, you ask yourself, so what? I mean, what is the material? What did they do? And ethnographic vignettes sometimes, now more than before, serve to highlight not social events or cultural data, but they serve to illustrate a theoretical point. And I think that has something to do with the, of course, the publishing scenery that is still dominated by American and British journals and publishing houses. And that has also entered, these writing conventions have also entered the German anthropological journals, which there are a few. Some are quite, you have everything from very good or neglectable, but it entered, which means shorter articles, less, in general, also less monographs are published, less field material, more theory, increasingly writing in English, and starting in the, nowadays it's normal, but before it was not, in the German writing conventions, to start with an abstract and with a conclusion, so at the beginning, so bundle it together to have very short information about what the whole thing is, so that you don't have to read the whole article. And then going through theoretical points that you want to illustrate with your material. So I would say, in many ways, there is not much left of German ethnological traditions. But, of course, there is the ethnology within the legal and political framework of Germany. And I think that is what I want to highlight. That is very important to understand what colleagues do and why they do it. My approach to history of the discipline follows three approaches. First, of course, it's the history of theories and fields of research and so on, but it's also a history of institutions and professional networks. And it's the analysis of the linkage between the political situation of the Federal Republic of Germany or the single federal states, because in every federal state has some kind own economical interests, and so they favor the existence of research institutes, maybe let's say in Heidelberg, Baden-Württemberg, about South Asia. They created the South Asia Institute because of economical interests. So that is why the third approach, political and economical situation, that either hinders or pushes the frame of the frame of the institutions and also the fields of research. we can see that from 45, 95 to the unification 1990, that the institutions in Germany had several ways of expansion. At the end of World War II, there were only Berlin, Leipzig, Göttingen, Köln, and Munich, which means, and I forgot Hamburg, which are 6 institutes. But Berlin and Leipzig were in the east then, and so only Göttingen, Köln, München, and Hamburg. So it's not much. And then there was a second, first wave of expansion immediately after the war in Marburg, Mainz, and Bonn. Why? Because of the federal organization of Germany. So in Hessen, there was no institute. In Rheinland-Pfalz, there was no institute. In Nordrhein-Westfalen, okay, there was Bonn, Cologne, but then there was founded a second one, which was also linked to the Latin America the political interest of that region in Latin America. Then there was a second wave of expansion in the 1960s, of course, due to the educational expansion in general in Germany. So it was much more easier to study. You had more students. There were more universities founded. And of course, 5 institutes of anthropology also were created. In these years, in the 60s, the museums and institutes, which were often together under one directory, like in Göttingen, in Köln, in Berlin, and in Hamburg, they separated. So we had 2 branches of intellectual anthropological fields, universities and museums. Before, the connection was much tighter, and which also means that students, regular students of anthropology, always had a link in these years to artifacts, to archival work, and so on. But that changed in the 60s with the separation of the 2 institutes. And museums and university institutes until nowadays, they regard each other kind of, the strange other. From the point of view of museums, the university institutes do too much blah blah on theoretical bling bling, and the university institutes have regarded museums, well, that's a place where the not very intellectual colleagues find a job. So to say that, that was a common line. It is slightly changing, thank God, that there are more interconnections even within the cities. But there is still a separation, which, for example, when I started to study in the early 80s, we were not even taught that there was an ethnographical collection which can be used and as fields of research, for example. And that was kind of, now we're interested in social structure. We don't want to have kind of strange boats from strange islands or whatever, objects. I mean, that's just objects. No, it was kind of more interest in social and cultural life worlds, which means non-material, which is a crazy idea. But that was dominating, I would say, until the 2010s or so. And I find that very strange and pitiful, but of course it changes nowadays a bit. After unification in 1990, new institutes or chairs, so like in Frankfurt Oder or mine in Bochum, Koblenz, Landau, Konstanz, and so on, were founded. But this kind of expansion is sometimes on a weak basis, because Frankfurt Oder, Bochum, and also Passau they are, yeah, you have one professorship, you have hardly any assistants. You are connected within, or you work within a faculty of, let's say, social sciences, which regard anthropology as kind of, well, I mean, they do strange things, or into literary studies or religious studies, whatever the shape of the university gives itself. And very often, like in Frankfurt Oder and in Passau, they were ad personam, which means, of course, when the chair emeritates or gets another job somewhere else, maybe the following, the person that follows is not an anthropologist, but a literary or a media studies or whatever colleague, which has nothing to do with what we understand as anthropology or ethnology. And that happened to Frankfurt Oder when Manfred Schiffauer retired, or to Passau when Susanne Schröter got another job in Frankfurt, and it will happen to mine. It will happen to mine because I am part of a very, let's say, hardcore objectivist social science faculty, and to them anthropology is of no use because it deals with real people, whereas and not enough with cover terms like racism, colonialism, or globalization, whatever is in. So I mean, we do dirty work to them, and are of no use to brand the university as something like an intellectual, but they understand an intellectual field of working. So my chair will be erased, and it's not because of me, it's because of disdain for the discipline. Last word before getting into the history a bit more. We have an increasing feminization. Can we say that? Can I say that in English? Is that a proper term? I have no idea. But if you see, only, let's say, 15 years ago, 29% of the professors were female, and now it's almost 50%. So anthropology in Germany is one of the disciplines where gender equality, at least in terms of employment, are 50-50. And whereas in other social sciences, it's in Germany, it's different. So an increasing feminization of the colleagues. Is there something which German ethnology, also history, archaeology, sometimes Germanistics and philologies are fond of, on how they self-understand themselves? Yes, they claim that there exists a freedom of science, but what does freedom mean? And but of course it goes back to Alexander von Humboldt, that science should be or critical to ideologies, free of political involvement, or well, if he would have lived today, of course, of economization, and that in Germany itself, that is reinforced, of course, by the NS complicity, so that political engagement per se is very touchy. Don't do it. Free from utilitarian motives, and that research and teaching should be coupled. It's not, which now is also changing in the German academic landscape. Some professorships are research professorships, others are more teaching professorships. And that, of course, is the death of Humboldt, because that's the basic idea. Do and learn. Do and learn, practice and raisonnement together. Committed or only to truth. Of course, what is truth? What Humboldt understood is to do basic research. I mean, he was not, of course, you know, he was not an anthropologist, but he was a zoologist, botanist, geoscientist, he did minors studies and so on. Well, we have to document. We have to look deeply into things, go beyond the superficial ordering. So do proper work, do hard work, and work with theories, but be skeptical. This kind of skepticism. So this is what sciences like anthropology have been through the years, but it changed from generation to a generation a bit more. This kind of the Humboldtian idea of teaching and research together was, that was supported by the German Research Society. It was founded in 1951, and by the influence of the US, France, and Britain, because they made it obligatory to German scientists to take young students, for example, in our case, with them into the field. Until then, young students did literary research. I mean, they read the old classics and blah, 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 and so on. And some of them only went into the field after that dissertation. Here we see Hans Rothert, who was, by the way, I mean, if you know this, the movie, The English Patient, the woman there is in fact Hans Rothert, who had a relationship with Almashi, which is Liam Neeson there in the film. And Hans Rothert, you see him with Rudolf Cooper as a young student. That is an example. It wasn't, if you applied for a grant, the professors had to write about how many young students they will take to the field. And then that was a prerequisite for funding, which is, I think, very good. And field work was the basic thing that anthropologists after World War II were longing for, because it was not possible, of course, during the Nazi times. Of course, there were colleagues who made expeditions and so on, but doing field work outside in the colonies of the others was basically impossible. So to bring Germany to a decent Western level, intellectually and academically, of course, you take people into the field, go out. At the end of 45, we can see three dominating schools. They still dominated, of course, at the end of the war. I call them the brown, the violet, and the dark blue anthropology. The browns, they were staunch Nazis. The violets were priests, missionaries. They were ultra-conservative, but non-racist, against all kind of racism and so on, and colonialism, but they were staunch authoritarian Catholics, clerics. And then you had colleagues like Leo Frobenius, whom I would call dark blue because it reminds to the uniforms of the Kaiser. He was an authoritarian character, a charismatic person, but he was anti-Nazi, which means because he rejected this idea of a superiority of races and so on. He even was as brave in these years to say that Africans are stronger and have more worthy than the degenerated Westerners. And he didn't say that for ideological reasons, but he was convinced to. He was convinced about that. And that, of course, was in staunch contrast with the Nazis. And he managed somehow to go through the Nazi times, but ideologically, yeah, he was more close to the Kaiser. The Violets, I mean, the priests, they were taken over slowly by the Nazis, which means, for example, Pater Wilhelm Schmidt, the guy on the right side, who was a cultural historian, and his institute, which was very important by then, was taken over by a person like Hermann Baumann, who, as a Nazi professor, was entitled to take the institute over, and the priests had to flee, and they fled to Switzerland. Yeah. They didn't go to Italy, of course. They fled to Switzerland because they were thrown out. They were ultra conservative, but they were no Nazis. And so this idea that the cultural historians had with their ideas of a basic monotheism as the basic religion of the world and so on, all that died, which means, of course, they didn't have students anymore. They had just missionaries. The missionaries went out in the field. They saw things with their own eyes. They did not sit like Wilhelm Schmidt and others just in their archives and constructed models of how to explain the world and so on. So they went into the field, and of course they came back cleansed by this let's say cultural, historical, and Catholic background, because many of them became we would say decent social and cultural anthropologists in the modern way. So the Violets, I would say, they died out, but the Nazis remained. And an important example is Wilhelm Mühlmann. He was the leading anthropologist in Germany after 45. He was was responsible for to make plans to cleanse and organize the East for German settlement, which means he was the one who had to establish categories of who is an evil group or an Untermensch or whatever, and who not, who could be Aryanized and so on. Because he got a professorship only in the mid 1954 in Breslau, which was already occupied by the Russians, he could claim that he never had a high position in academy. And so he was very clever. I mean, he was not intellectually, he was not a stupid person. So, but he was an opportunist, and he maintained his racial ideas, which he published in 43 and already in 1940, and in 45 in a new book, which was not delivered out because in Berlin was burning. There was another, there he was lucky as well, because in these writings, he was, I mean, I got a copy of that. It was worse than all the other things that he wrote before. After the war, he took that book and changed the wordings. So it was not anymore about higher and lower races or non-races or whatever, but he was working about social elites, elite building, charisma, and things like that. So in fact, he was maintaining his idea, but the wording changed. The wording changed, and it took years to get him out of the office. And that was basically the work of his students, because they got to know him better. They found things out that were covered, of course, and they became, let's say, rebels against their father. They committed patricide, I would say. Fritz Kramer is one of the most influential anthropologists after the war, I would say, and he preceded postmodernism for a decade. Christian Siegrist, he fought with the Afghans against the Russians, against the British, against the king. I mean, he was a red rebel for independence also of the Cape Verde Islands and so on, and professor of sociology. And another of his students became an ethnopsychiatrist. So they found things out. They published about their father, so to say, and then Mühlmann was over. But Frobenius was not. I said that Frobenius had this connection to Kaiser Wilhelm, and Kaiser Wilhelm, there's a wonderful new book, well, it's not that new, but about the exchange of letters between them. And Kaiser Wilhelm always signed, "Your humble student Wilhelm." So there was a close connection between them, and the son of the Kaiser, who was the boss of the head of the Ford company in Cologne, he provided Frobenius for free for each of his 15 expeditions with 12 cars. Yeah. And when I said that Frobenius was not a Nazi, but he was a staunch reactionary authoritarian person, of course he had to get through the Nazi times. And here you see him on the right with on a celebration with Hermann Göring's niece at the German colonial ball. But Frobenius was influential in two other ways, which were not thought about. First of all, he inspired the neighbourhood movement, and he was considered to be a hero for Black independence movements in Africa, because he was one of the first who recognized Africans as people with dignity and with strength, and he admired them. So he became like an important person. And you see here, who is it? It is Senghor, but you have other pictures of African leaders who, when they came to Bonn to visit the government, they always went before to the Frobenius Institute to honor this person. Also, his student Hans Wieschoff, he was very important as with the decolonization process of the United Nations, because in the 1930s he carried out a lot of research with African leaders and their sons, who later became often new presidents and whatever. He was made secretary of decolonization of the UN, and he died in the air crash with Dag Hammarskjöld. So, I mean, there is a strong political link to the freedom movement in Africa, and strangely enough, influenced and fostered also by this very ambiguous person of Frobenius. Now I make it a bit short because time is running. Because of all this involvement of the Nazis, of authoritarian people like Frobenius with politics and so on, their assistants and students, they they committed themselves very strongly to the Humboldtian idea. No ideologies, no political engagement. Don't touch political topics, just do your work. And this generation, was not very much interested in theory building and so on, but they wanted to document in a detailed way their fields of Adolf Friedrich, for example, in Afghanistan, Westphal Helbusch, for example, in Iraq, and so on. So there were no contributions to intellectual movements or whatever. They wanted to document, and they rejected all kind of political involvement. In these years, the so-called Great Generation was still internationally got a lot of reviews. Why? That no German scholar gets nowadays. Why? Because until then, first of all, many Western scholars could still read German. So they read these books. And because of this detailed documentation of artifacts, of rituals, of language, of whatever, they were cherished as regional specialists, not as inspiring intellectuals, but as regional specialists. And that is why they got, let's say here, Trimble 22 reviews in American Anthropologist, in Man in American Antiquity, and so on. And this is was very surprising finding, because this generation and these teachers were always to present it to me as, I mean, they are boring, forget them. Yeah, I mean, what did they do? Nobody knows about them. Well, outside as regional specialists, they were recognized. Well, what were the saints of the time? Of course, Adolf Bastian, James Fraser, Oswald Spengler, and Frobenius themselves. I mean, that is what the Gray generation cherished and taught. Still the older intellectuals. Why? Of course, because they did not want to touch political topics. So they read the ethnographies of these people. I mean, maybe with the exception of Oswald Spengler. The Great Generation, with their interest in documenting, also met in one point the interest of the young generation who went into studies shortly after the war, because for the first time, these young people could get out of Germany but not to Spain or to Britain, but to foreign countries to experience the other. They were kind of, they had that in their minds, yeah, out of this post-war great Germany with these boring universities and so on. So feel the field. And we have here two colleagues, for example, who belong to that. So the Grays had there, well, they met the interest of the young generation. And of course, there were others like Schlesier, who was the first one in Germany who in the 60s taught British social anthropology. Nobody else did that until the 60s. Yeah? Malinowski, Radcliffe Brown, Westermarck, all the others, Mary Douglas, yeah, they were married. The whole generation of British anthropologists from the 19th century onwards, they weren't taught. So they were the ones. There were young colleagues who started that. And there, of course, Malinowski, Boas, Mary Douglas, that was the literature that students were filtered in these days. Of course, the young generation of the 69ers, they were not happy with that. They thought, okay, yes, out into the field, okay, deal with the other, okay, but I mean, just document, well, but document the cruelties of humanitarian crises, of human rights problems, of land grabbing, do some social catastrophes. So become engaged. And political, that was something that changed the Humboldtian idea in these years. Political engagement, turning to theories in general. And here you see some colleagues in their later years. I didn't find some pictures of when they were young. There they are much more, nowadays they were much more tamed, so to say. But in their in the 60s and early 70s, they were the hot rebels, so to say. And for the discipline, it was important because these people controlled and occupy the annual conference of the anthropologists, because they wanted a resolution against genocide, how they called it, in Brazil, which means anthropology has to take a stance, a position. Don't just document. No, you have to cite, and you have to cite with the weak. And there was only one established professor who supported that, but basically it broke anthropological life as a professional community for 7 years. So the upcoming next session was 7 years later, because the old generation was fed up with that, with these youngsters, these rebels, and well, the rebels, maybe some of them disappeared, and what was left was then recollected in the mid-70s, so very late. So there's a break, an institutional or a personal network break. What did people read in these times? Lévi-Strauss, Léris, and of course, Margaret Mead. They were some kind of their saints. The point was that the red youngsters were still too young, and the institutional positions were still filled with people with a great generation. So, and they lasted until the 80s or sometimes into the 90s, which means it was very difficult, let's say, to get German anthropology out of this kind of, okay, yeah, we do document, we do field work, and that's good, and but no involvement. And the youngsters who started to look for other ways of expressing themselves so that they could get jobs. And against that, the green or wild anthropology, as I say, came into being. These were all these people that, for example, were my teachers. They started to develop, I would say, postmodernism before modernity. I mean, before the writing culture thing and so on. They turned also back to cultural history, to wildness, to trans possessions, and to ontological other worlds 3 decades before the ontological turn with the reverse de Castro and so on. And there's just the 4 people that you can see here is still, that's still just an example, but they were, of course, attracting a lot of students. Feminist interests, gay and lesbian were not so important by then, but medicine, psychology, discourse analysis, trans and possession, and hiring the first or pushing forward to hire non-white colleagues, all this stuff, esoterics. Yeah, you had all this bundle of was there and could develop, but they could not fulfill. They could not fill professorships or important positions because the Greys were already there or still there. So they had the same problem like the Reds, for example. Of course, here is a collection of what was influencing students at this time by these green anthropologists. Castaneda as an example of esoterics, Parin Morgenthaler, Parin Mattei, of course, psychotherapy, and Il Mondo Magico de Ernesto de Martino, which is possession and trance and magic and so on. Yeah, I'm coming to an end. Don't worry. Now we are in the time around the 2000s. It started in the 90s, I would say, after the unification. So to give you just an Ausblick, an out view of what happened after the reunification. Here also you see that they came back to the Humboldtian ideas of, well, don't involve too much into these political fights and positions like in different Marxist groups also. But if you are interested in political problems, social problems, do that in research. But don't take sides, but document it and bring that into being. And for example, Georg Pfeffer, who was my teacher, one of my teachers, did that. Yeah, I mean, his father was the so-called Führer of the German sociology. But every discipline had a Führer, like it was the Führerprinzip, and his father was the Führer of sociology, German sociology. And he was, of course, I mean, he suffered much under them and under him, because he knew all these Nazis who were in power before as a young kid, because they all came to them to each other and talked about what they had lost in the war through the Allies and so on. So he opened himself up, I would say, as like in a rebellion, and turned to Le Dumont, to Durkheim, to social structure, to rituals, and these things. So doing micro studies, but with a political impact locally. Maya Nadig is another person who is, I just put her there because she's someone of this Swiss psychoanalytically informed anthropology. And another teacher of mine, Thomas Hauschild, he's the one who did magic in the Mediterranean area. Why do I show these three different peoples? Because I would say it's multicolored. There's no in the years between 90 or late 80s until the early 2000s, I would say there was no general trend. There was no general trend like before, and no dominating trend in anthropology. Of course, I mean, what was important there? Clifford Geertz, Foucault, Bourdieu, the writing culture debate, which Kramer already had preceded, Judith Butler. So these are the saints of the time. And yeah, we don't come to the silver grade generation because this is now, and my research is over, was over in 1990. Just to tell you, of course, that nowadays the freedom of science does mean freedom free of unuseful research. So research has to be useful. It's committed to utility, not politically, but of course it has to be marketed, ranking, quantification. I mean, all the cruelties of the Bologna system and neoliberal reduction, we live under them, we work under them, and some have habitualized that very strongly. Some old farts, just like me, try to resist, but we have to deal with it. So we can say farewell to Humboldt and the red carpet for neoliberalism. Yeah, and that would be, yeah, this is the last slide, really, I admit it. But is there something like a resume? Yes, there is a slow but steady expansion of anthropological positions. And it's a strong feminization. Hallmarks are still long-lasting fieldwork, deep involvement, presentism and historical interest likewise, and still regional expertise is important. Of course, the movement from Humboldt to Friedman, and what considers the history of the discipline. It's marked by ruptures in theoretical approaches linked to generational, political, and utilitarian parameters. It's still oriented towards Anglo and French intellectual life, and innovative approaches developed within Germany were often considered as, I mean, before I spoke to David, and he asked, what is the situation in Germany? And here is the same, yeah. You have someone who does innovative things, and everybody is whining about, So, and afterwards, after 10 years, when these things were developed in other intellectual nations, for example, they remind themselves that, that there was already something, which means in the end, I wouldn't go as far as to say that anthropology in Germany hates itself, but it is still strongly fighting with self-recognition and of being proud of what they or we do. Thank you for your attendance.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dieter, for an absolutely fascinating overview. It opens up all sorts of inner currents into a world that we think must exist, but we're never quite sure what's inside it. So really, that was absolutely marvelous. I'm sure colleagues will have many questions, but just a couple of tiny clarifications, which are not exactly the same. The first question I would have is, I understand in your opening remarks, you say there is really no distinct German anthropology anymore, but I mean, philosophically speaking, do we have such things anywhere in the world these days? I mean, is that even theoretically possible? I mean, if you were going to wave a wand, I mean, if the Minister of Education asked you to draw up schemes for a German anthropology, even if you agreed with the term, of course, which you might not, I mean, what might possibly emerge from your thoughts?
Well, I mean, of course, I tried to pinpoint things, yeah, and to be a bit more acute and not so differentiated, because that's the right question that you ask. But what I'm saying, what I was trying to show is that there are certain ways of developing arguments, even though we are connected, and even though that, I mean, for example, big exchange with colleagues from all over the world, and I'm reading Arabic stuff or stuff from Thomas Hilland Erickson, from Brazilian colleagues, and I get many influences. But the question is not, is there a German anthropology, a proper one, but are there remnants of that come out of a specific social political environment under which academics in their work within their country, which is the institutional framework, of course, which limits you, yeah, which limits you. I would say, and maybe João could say that I think in Portugal, maybe colleagues have other restrictions like as in Britain or in Germany. And the other thing is, I consider the German situation a special one because we have much more breaks that are political breaks in the younger history, and the generations reacted to that. If I talked, for example, with it is always wonderful to talk with my colleague Brigitta Hauser-Schäublin. She worked in Göttingen, but she's a Swiss, she's from Switzerland, and she always wonders about these strange Germans. Yeah, what are they? Why do they have all these problems that do not exist in Switzerland, because they have another institutional framework? That is the point. I do not want to say there is something close. Yeah, there is the German anthropology. That's not my point. But are there specificities? And I do think they are.
Well, I look forward to looking at this more. But you mentioned Zhao, and of course he's in the audience, so I think we just have to ask him what he thinks, if that's the right way.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice.
Good afternoon, Zhao. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can absolutely. How nice to hear from you. I hope you're well.
Well, thank you. I hope you are well too. And Dieter, it's been great hearing you and very interesting.
Hi, João.
Hi, how are you? This issue that you've been raising, these issues that you've been raising, are really very important. And I think that by relation to what you were saying just now, if one takes what you say and one tries to place it in the Iberian Peninsula, one would find a similar sort of break related to the dictatorships and to the way in which the dictatorships, it started changing before the end of the dictatorships, both in Portugal and in Spain, but it really has a very similar sort of story. the thing that today I wanted to ask you is, how do you find German anthropology relates to other European anthropologies? What we are actually doing right now. How do you feel that works out? Because one of the issues that I find and this applies to French situation, which I know quite well, and the Italian one, and the Portuguese and the Spanish, we are mediated by American fashion. And therefore, the dialogue between us often passes by the American network, as it were, and that is something that I'm really interested in seeing. How do you feel that that anthropology in Germany is actually creating its European network?
Yeah, well, I would say on the level of confession, yeah. For example, within the EASA, and it's necessary, and what is there something like a European view that is different from or other similarities, or how can we establish another politics of publishing houses, yeah, where American networks are not that important. Yes. That is one side, I would say. But on the other hand, and then of course we always invite each other. Yeah, we go to an Italian university, or I go to Spain, or we invite to something. So there is this kind of idea of practice, practicing together, and even in the German funding organization, not just on an EU level, but in the German funding organization, very often there is this point that you have to have European or foreign, but which basically means European and maybe Americans, or if you are very connected to the world in practice. I mean, I don't mean in brain-wise. That common work does happen, but I don't I don't see it as a it's still not very it's still not very dominating or turning into something that could it's still on a low level or on an individual level. Yeah.
This is an interesting thing because, of course, you know, I was listening to your talk, and you are bringing a lot of French authors, Italian authors that were influential, and that, for example, in England, were not that influential. I don't think Leiry or De Martino were influential until rather recently, and so it's interesting that cross. Intellectual cross-cutting is actually happening.
Yes, I mean, take David's own work on Westermarck. Yeah, I mean, a Finnish, Swedish, Russian subject living in Morocco being pushed aside because from a marginal university. What was it, Tampere, I think, or and being kind of written out of the history by successors or colleagues, and now through a public, through David's and other people's cherishing, more and more people read Westermarck or exchange about that, and the same happens with De Martino. But De Martino now is entering even the American anthropological discourse in Germany since the 1980s. People read, if they didn't read Martino, of course they were taught about De Martino, and yeah, that happens. That happens, I would say.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question? I'm not sure.
Of course you did. I think you have. You have.
What?
I think you have.
I think we can carry on this discussion, but I want to bring in Herbert Lewis now. Professor Lewis, are you there? It's so nice to hear from you.
I have to unmute. There we go. Thanks very much for this really fine talk. I really appreciate it. I began my career quite a few years ago in anthropology in Ethiopia, in the era when of gray anthropology, I guess you'd call it, when Ike Haberland was in control. But today I've been fortunate to live long enough and to work long enough to be a colleague and a friend of the students of Ivo Strecker and Günter Schley. I find that this cohort of people who work in Ethiopia, these German anthropologists, mostly German, to be among the finest colleagues I have and I know. And I agree very much with David about our connection with younger German anthropologists. And one side issue, I also had become friends with Georg Pfeffer, and I saw him shortly before he died, he and Monica. But to sort of a question, could you say something about the racist hangover in the gray anthropology of Haberland at all, perhaps through Kulturkreis and the connection between biology and culture and the idea of newer and older cultures, layers of cultures, and so on?
I'm not a specialist on it's Eike Haberland. Yeah, we have several Haberlands in German.
Yeah, Eike.
Of Eike Haberland, but Eike Haberland, of course, was following this idea of Frobenius and Jensen to study some. It was always the priest king or the leopard skin chief. He was always interested in chiefdoms, and but I'm not a specialist to tell you about his about how he linked that to the ideas of race. What I do know is that the Red generation especially targeted Haberland because he was close to the imperial house of Ethiopia, and because he was supporting from the Red point of view a cruel autocrat and who treats other black groups in Ethiopia as less as under, well, as not in a racist way. So I know the reception or the perception of Haberland but I'm not too familiar with his proper work.
Okay.
I don't know whether that helps you, but Ethiopia and Sudan have always been fields of research of German anthropologists. I mean, not just Haberland or Schley, or also Rottenburg and my colleague here in Bochum, Falge, all these people. It's always, Ethiopia is a very, or Strecker, of course, Ivo Strecker, klar. Strecker is super, but I am not too familiar with their proper work, and that is maybe the problem with recognition of other colleagues, because German anthropology is so very much organized within regions. So what do I connect to? I connect to Spanish and to Arab intellectuals and so on, but I have no idea what my cherished colleague Helene Basu, her networks in India, yeah. And I read their stuff if it touches like spirit possession or healing or what, but not for yeah. I mean, it's this regional thing that we have in Germany.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much.
That is wonderful. Yeah, Georg Pfeffer. I wrote a part in the obituary in I think it was the Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, because he was my first teacher. And that was important. He taught about family, kinship, yeah, and he's a young student. I thought, what is that, kinship? And of course, I was a beginner. And I thought, oh God. And I remember that the girl next to me asked me, do you think anybody is going to pay us one day for knowing about kinship in Africa? And that kept into my mind. No, Georg was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Did someone have a hand up? Denisa Butnaru, did you have your hand up? If you did, please feel free to ask your question, or maybe that was just a false indication. Perhaps just whilst we're waiting for that, there are a couple of questions in the chat which we can turn to.
Joao, you have your hand or still up? Did you just forget it, or do you have another question?
I forgot.
Okay.
I'm terribly sorry. I've taken it down now.
Okay.
No, okay. Thank you. Sorry for that.
So there's a question here from Sriracha Mehta, who says, is there any energy behind developing a holistic German anthropological approach to the social problems facing Germany today, such as immigration, anti-Semitic tendencies, and so on?
I didn't understand the first words. Are there any?
Well, is there any energy? In other words, is there any momentum towards developing a holistic German anthropological approach towards social problems in Germany?
A holistic approach. I mean, well, it's more an atomized approach, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many projects on racist attacks in a certain area or whatever. So it's very much, let's say, atomized. But just these days, Susanne Schröter, she's trying to do that. Susanne Schröter in Frankfurt, she has written something like, what was the title? It just came out, I think, last week, and now she's in the media everywhere. Like something, we screwed it all, the West goes down the drain or something like that. That's the idea of the book, The End of the West. But she focuses, of course, on Germany and social problems, and she's trying to give an anthropological, holistic approach to it. I haven't read the book yet, but it's just out for a week. So I don't know what's in it, but I know her, and I know that she has this holistic idea. Yeah. But other? May I ask you, why do you ask the question?
Are you here? Sriracha, you're welcome to answer directly if you like.
Yeah, if you put your hand up, Sriracha, then I know that you're willing to speak and I can allow you to speak. If you don't want to, don't put your hand on as well, of course. I see there's a second question as well from them.
Mm. Well, in that, just whilst we're waiting, could we go back to that student rebellion period? Because there's that famous phrase, I always forget the exact German, but it's, you know, in these robes lies the excrement of 1,000 years, when the students really were active there. But so is this a general revolutionary movement of which the anthropology students were a part, or was it led by the anthropology students? How does it fit?
No. It was. I would rather say that the anthropology students were a bit latecomer as actors,
Right?
because that already happened in 67, 68, and so on, and the traumatic experience for both of them, the Reds and the Greys, happened in 69. Before, of course, there were different student groups, mainly in Marburg. I know that, which they were very much against the only professor that they had there, who was, I mean, the poor man. Yeah, I mean, I think he was the most boring colleague, and what he did and wrote, and you had all these. So in Marburg there were actions, but in general it was a general thing. The anthropology students were latecomers. The parole is unter den Talaren, beyond the talar, I don't know whether in British that exists, these kind of ropes.
We call them ropes, yeah.
Beneath the ropes, it's a rhyme, unter den Talaren der Muff von 1000 Jahren, which means the odor, the bad odor, odor. No, not like your speaker in the parliament. Order. I mean, but the odor.
Yeah, your pronunciation is correct. Yeah. So would you just repeat it once? Is it well?
Unter. I can write it. I can write it in the chat.
Of course.
Okay. Where is it here?
Thank you. Yeah. Good. Well, Bettina, we'll come to your question in a moment, but here Suranshi clarifies the question. It says, the purpose of my question is to ascertain exactly how the German anthropological segment, I guess, community, views their role in contemporary German society, especially in avoiding repeating past patterns of negative behaviors.
How the anthropological community, I just repeated it.
Views their role in society. So for example, if
okay,
is there a widespread sense of social responsibility vis-a-vis German society? I think is the question.
Well, I would say that, and I wrote that in my book, which was of course published years ago, but there already I wrote that increasingly anthropologists are present in, I'm not talking about social media, but the classical media, on TV, as experts or as discussion partners or commentating some, I don't know, a program on culture, whatever. So increasingly that happens, or in journals, writing articles, writing comments, writing analysis of that. And since I wrote my book, that has increased even more. I mean, you very often anthropological, it's not so much that anthropological books are reviewed, for example, but the anthropologists are taken as specialists for something. And for example, I'm very often contacted by the state channels of the individual federal states when something in Gibraltar happens, because I mean Gibraltar was one of my research fields, and oh, what happens to Gibraltar? Schengen. Yeah, well, I know they're in Schengen, but are they out? Are they in? What happens? Strange people or whatever. So they contact me. Then I become active. But I'm not running around with a bell and so that happens, of course, to other colleagues as well. I mean, for example, Susanne Schröter, to her, that hasn't happened because she knows how. I don't say that in a mean way, but she knows how to market herself. She does good work. Some I don't agree with very much of that, but she does decent good work, and she knows how to market herself. I don't know that. That's not my thing. I can't do that.
Indeed. Well, Bettina's been waiting. Would you like to ask your question live? Please go ahead if you would, Bettina. If you put your hand up again, Henning will spotlight you and we can go from there. So Bettina's hand is not up, so I'll just read out her question then. Sorry, Bettina says that the environment is too noisy. No problem, that's absolutely no problem at all. We'll read out your talk. She says, I enjoyed your talk very much. She was educated in Germany in ethnology, and I could connect many experiences that she has had to the historical developments that you present. One experience she had was whenever she applies for a scholarship, there was almost never an anthropologist or an ethologist in the committee. In the light of that background, I want to ask you how ethnology connects to other academic disciplines in Germany, besides fighting for existence or dissolving into other social sciences.
Well, how does it connect to other disciplines? Maybe anthropologists or ethnologen are not, or ethnologinnen are not in the committees, but increasingly, whenever there is a big program, yeah, which should be interdisciplinary, everybody always wants an ethnologen or an ethnologin in it, because that shows that, yeah, it's the life world, somebody who does real work. So I had this experience myself, and many other colleagues tell me that, of course, then you are in a circle of colleagues of other disciplines. They may be very nice, or may be very opportunistic or whatever, but you always have the problem to explain Adam and Eve. Yeah, from the beginning, why do we do what we do? What is it, and why is that science? And so I'm, for example, fed up with being part of that. I just want to do my work, and this interdisciplinary, that happens to many colleagues that I talk to, because then you are cherished as well. That's our anthropologist, does interesting stuff, but it's, I mean, it's like when Angela Merkel came to the Queen. Yeah, then you have a special program for Prince Philip, and for, you know, that's a special program for Prince Philip and for Merkel's husband. And yeah, they can do nice things. They talk about animal protections or flowers also. And so you always need some of the decoration, but the real stuff is between Angela and Lisbeth. So you are an adornment very often. Of course, it depends on how you how the colleagues are. For example, I have a colleague, an economist, with whom I do not share very much, but we understand each other, and I don't have to begin with Adam and Eve. Yeah, I can start with the Romans. So I mean, or with Napoleon, just to give you an idea. I have nothing to do with what he does, but we respect each other. And very often this respect is not there, because if you're in such a group, you always fight for money. Who gets what, then who gets how many projects, and this and that. And I'm so fed up with that. I mean, that's such a loss of energy, of lifetime. And I have done that very often until now. That is, I have always worked in disciplinary context. In Bochum as social scientist. When I was in Austin, at UT in Austin, I was in the department for Germanic studies. An anthropologist there, why? An anthropologist with Mediterraneans? Yeah, why? Because they needed someone to attract the students with crazy ideas, yeah, like European football or German pop songs or whatever. So so that we can still Goethe and Schiller and Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl. So I'm so fed up with that. But maybe it's also a question of age. And that's why I say I do not want to work interdisciplinary unless I understand myself with whomever, but I want to work.
Yes, and presumably
I'm a preacher.
Not at all, but presumably the DFG structure, because it's so distinctive, is also a defining characteristic here. Because unless it's changed, the DFG, of course, is simply one very big research council for everybody. And so you're in effect competing, every time you apply for money, you're competing with a huge variety of different disciplinary approaches. Is that still the case? Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a question in the chat from Ildiko Christoph, who says, have you considered the impact of German anthropology in Eastern Europe, for example, on Hungary? So there was an important influence of Alexander von Humboldt on early Hungarian anthropology, for example, and maybe there are other ways that German anthropology appeared there. And she also has a second part to her question. She says, Humboldt was not exactly apolitical or non-political. He said he was already engaged in the anti-slavery movement and criticized the Spanish monarchy. And this was an important aspect of his influence in other countries, and particularly on our scholarly traditions, such as those in Hungary. And thank you very much for an informative lecture. So 2 questions then.
Definitely. I didn't want to say that he was apolitical, not at all. I mean, what you meant, what David just said that you were writing, of course. But that's Humboldt as a political intellectual. The other thing is Humboldt as a great scientist, to document, to be very acute, to be detailed, and that's what I mean. And not getting kind of an you can be political by himself, by his experience, but he was not like an agent to research something that can be used. It can be used, but he was not paid for that. That is what I mean with political motives. Maybe I totally agree. And then I forget the other point.
The influence of German anthropology, in particular Humboldt, on Eastern Europe.
I have no idea. I'm very sorry. I'm what I know the influence of a Hungarian anthropologist on German anthropology, Lajos Vojda, who was, I think he was of the Pfeilkreuzer, they said, and he was professor until the 1980s in Munich. And some colleagues didn't want to be on my website because I had an interview with Vojda. And they said, we don't want to be with an ex-Pfeilkreuzer on that. So, but that's an anecdote. No, I have no idea. I have no idea about Humboldt's being received.
Mm-hmm. How his work was received. Yeah.
Received, how he was received. I'm very sorry.
Well, did I understand correctly in your talk that you were not making a sharp distinction between Austrian spheres and German spheres of anthropology? Or perhaps I misunderstood.
That's a misunderstanding. What I said was that personal networks between the institutes in Switzerland and Germany are they are dense, yeah. But of course, the Austrian intellectual landscape and the Austrian political framework of education or whatever, and the Swiss one, they are totally different, yeah. They can allow themselves, or not allow, because it's not organized, but they have other foci, they have other interests than, for example, someone who has a regional department in one of the federal states of West Germany. So that is what I meant, but there is a strong interconnection. It's always the talk that Germans flood Switzerland with their academics, but there are many Swiss colleagues who are professors, assistants within Germany as well. So that's what I mean, though, and because of the language, of course, the DGV, it's not a nice name, or DGSKA, also because of the D, Germany, Deutschland, because Swiss, Austrian, and now also an Italian colleague from Brixen in Italy, and Südtirol, and I think even Luxembourg now, they are, it's more on a language level, are also participating there. So yeah, it's like a Kulturkreis. I mean, Kulturkreis doesn't mean one against the other, but it means a kind of dense and many, maybe more interconnection than outside, towards outside. Yeah, kind of bundle of interconnections, dense interactions. That's what they have. But of course, they have other traditions. They have other. They read more French intellectuals that we don't know. I mean, in Germany, we read the people that are known, or that someone discovers. But in Switzerland, it's totally different. I suppose in Austria it's also with Balkanic states, or because of their interconnections, maybe it's also would be also different.
Yes, well, I see that Peter Rohbacher is in the audience. Do you want to comment about that, Peter? Peter's at Vienna, you see. I don't know whether you would like to, or whether you're in a position where you can say anything.
I don't see what Peter.
Peter Rohbacher.
Yeah, but what is his question?
He's no. I was wondering whether he was in the audience, because he's a postdoc student in Vienna, and or colleague in Vienna, and I was wondering whether he would like to make a comment. But he's I think perhaps not able to answer us. So if you have any more questions, please do feel free to answer them, colleagues. Otherwise, I think the obvious one before we stop is the influence of the Max Planck Institute. Has it had a great influence or not? But it'd be wonderful if you could give us some sense of the impact that it's had.
Yeah. I mean, in Halle we have two ethnological institutions. We have now a department at the university, and we have the Max Planck Institute, which means Halle has become, and the institute has at the university they have a decent number of jobs, of positions, and so. And the Max Planck has, I think, now they have 3 sections, and many researchers, and that's wonderful, because young colleagues they can enter there if they are accepted, and can interchange with colleagues from all over the world, being in Halle and working on different subjects, but on different. I think they have 3 sections now. One was like conflicts in African groups. That was Günther Schlee, and then we had Chris Hahn with post-Soviet societies, and now there's a 3rd one led by Biao Xiang. I don't know yet what he's doing, but it has a great influence. And I myself, I got the market always was empty for gifted young assistants. Yeah, and you wanted to hire someone, and then, oh gosh. Yeah, and nowadays, you have so many interesting people. And for example, I hired someone. You know, she just presented her. We talked. She showed me what she did. I never heard of her, but she was going through the whole Halle thing, and a wonderful young colleague. And that happens everywhere. That I think it has been beneficial. It has been beneficial. I do not know how far Halle has an outreach out of the German context. Personally, of course, through the students who come from all over the world, but on a cooperation level, or if in Britain, for example, colleagues know that something like that existed. I know that in the managing board, there's a friend of mine, John Bornemann, who just lives 500 meters away now. He, an American emeritated professor, there are these international connections, but I do not know how far that reaches out. Is it known in Britain that there is something like that in amongst our colleagues? Or?
Oh, of course, because you see, one of the founding directors, Chris Hahn, before he moved there, he was a dean and professor of anthropology at the University of Kent. And the anthropological world is quite small still, even though there are quite a lot of anthropologists. And so everybody knew very well that he'd gone there. So it meant there was a strong certainly interest in the way that it was going to develop. Yeah, no doubt at all.
I find it super that this institute exists. Yeah. The only thing that I don't like is that they have no branch for Mediterranean studies.
The key thing, though, with regard to this question of the way that anthropology works with other disciplines in Germany, is that what was the Max Planck Society thinking when they founded it? Because we assumed, when we heard about this in the early 1990s, that it was an attempt to rebuild social anthropology after the disasters of the Second World War. They felt it hadn't quite recovered, and therefore they wanted to give it some impetus. But that might just be a completely mistaken impression, because it was just what we thought. Do you happen to know why they founded it?
I know that it was founded after they decided that they wanted to, also in Halle, or Leipzig, no, I think it's Halle, found the Institute for Evolutionary Biology. The guy, Pabo, he just won the Nobel Prize, I think, yeah, yesterday. Is that possible? Yeah. So, and I know that before they wanted a classical, not a four-field anthropology, but a two-field, biologists, the Bonies and us, in one institute. And amongst anthropologists or ethnologen, there was a great resistance, because they said, oh no, not again, yeah. Let us do our work. And then there was a strong impulse and a political pressure to create the Chris Hahn thing. But before, they should be under one. They should have been under one roof.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. That's very logical. Because what comes out from all of your early descriptions of colleagues who were working in anthropology in Germany before the war is that they didn't really have a clear conception of a separate cultural anthropology or social anthropology and physical anthropology. It was still mixed up in their minds. And that division, I think, comes in gradually, or you don't think?
Well, maybe. I didn't research that, but it's possible. I mean, one thing that the break of 45 brought was that previous chairs or institutes who had the physical and the cultural within their name were separated. Right. Or did not exist anymore as one unit, but then they had the physical ones and the other ones. So that is something that pushed, of course, anthropology, and also there was American and British policy, also because they wanted to foster or push a decent social and cultural science that can be useful for regional studies or whatever, away from the biological thing, besides, of course, of the implication, to the race question. Because many of these professors who had in their domination, or institutes that had in their domination both, were staunch racists. Like, for example, I can't remember the name now, in Jena, there was, Jena was that place, and I mean, these people were racist anthropologists, of course, even long before the Nazis.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that has had any influence or following, which resulted in the creation of the Halle separation.
Yeah, we'll have to ask next time we have the opportunity. I was just going to mention, of course, that social anthropology, even the English term in the late 19th century, was used in that sense of a racist biological anthropology, also in English. You can sometimes find it when continental writers are using the term. I came across one called Carlos Clossen when I was looking at that writing in the Journal of Political Economy. In 1896, I remember he said, yeah, latest developments in social anthropology, by which he meant his kind of biological anthropology. And so, you're already in English, and so we stopped understanding that use of the term after really quite quickly. So by the time after the First World War, social anthropology meant something quite different.
When did that change happen?
Well, it must have been between it must have been between. It must have been that. It must have been with the war, because by the time you get after that, social anthropology is used quite freely to mean what it meant, what it means to us today.
After which war?
The Great War, after 1918.
Okay.
Yeah, it must be then. I mean, I can double check that, but I don't see any of that kind of reference to a biological version of social anthropology after 1918.
So in Germany that existed until the end of the Nazis, because then they, of course, they changed the terms, which, I mean, that's and they used Sozial Anthropologie. And that's why I criticized the young generation. Yeah, they said, "Oh, we want to be Sozialanthropologen." I said, "Don't you know what history that is? It's not social anthropology like the modern, I mean, the 100-year-old British tradition. It is biology, and biology in culture, or biology in society, whatever. But it's biological, and." I can't understand that. Yeah, they want to be also political correct, and oh gosh, yeah, against racism, and then they take the most racist term to name themselves.
Yeah,
not having any clue, and you can explain that 100 of times. You can give them literal. Oh gosh, that makes me sick. Yeah.
Well, we're almost out of time. But is there a final remark you would like to leave for your audience just before we close?
Well, I mean, I see that there are still 22 participants, and which means either half of them are asleep, because I talked so much, or maybe it was, yeah. But I hope it was interesting to you, because yeah. What I wanted to show is that beyond all this kind of intermingling and mixing and exchange and what culture really is, there are still national trends. Yeah? In some way, some things survive and come up in other times unexpectedly, and we should have a look at it. And of course, my basic aim of the whole thing is not about German anthropology, but to talk about the elephant in the room, which is American hegemoniality, because they never culturalize themselves. They're just they're just anthropologists.
We're
okay,
not going to
now I preach again. I will stop that.
We won't be able to solve that problem today because we run out of time. But I think that's a nice note to end our seminar. So thank you very much indeed for that. And you'll see that it assures us that he's not asleep. And I'm happy to believe that. So we thank our speaker. And please do join the Royal Anthropological Institute as a fellow if you're not already, because it's only because of your support we can have wonderful events like this and flourish in the future. You can see how to join via our website. And thank you very much to our speaker this evening. And I'm sorry we're not here in person.